Alright, ever since I flood in the bay, adane blame game. Ebisi Ghana for and yesu banye. Ebisi engineers and enye papa. Ebinso say, abayano and abon. Now buy what a task force. Our cast would be seen to Yano Quine. And Anya Juma, and ensure you have a fight into abayano and abon. And I feel to me call ya mind this for the Misoka can say. Red Bank bread and people for Sikabi as a project on the phone of the Garrett project. Amas Sikano, if I hene. Sikano omodi omo nyusu amfa anya de nanka Red Bank say emfa meye say edibesi insuyire anokwan wa akra no na eno eka ho bi ana ama insuyire gatas yentimi antitim yentimi amwa ama insuyire na no ansi a ene abeku nipa abusuan de sansam no bro report be na Red Bank de ababontin because sansam ne ba ye no Red Bank amanfo bi traso mbenya information no about sikano de bia fire Red Bank at the breakdown ababontin de na ekoso ye de hunsem nyina bro aha Ashanti Media mo somfo hene na edusi poku na me no wadi ahye na no first time I subscribe the channel no like na fi wa share so e de am fa dwonche to comment section ase na fi notification bell na aboso e biri bia e de video ba betum no nsa nso benya kabi. Alright, now the Garrett project no na sika da so 350 million US dollars and a Red Bank at the buy sika no omuchirem say start 2019 and a buy flood ne buy no said ye ni se mampanyini John Dramani Mahama bra na o opposition na do ni MPP wo so no waka say aban na abon and one hwen to mean si flood na kwan nsuo yira be fa nipa ama sa atam no kwa nipa ba ko sese ewuye na enam se wode yes a campaign nti obaye no waka say obete tax force and what a tax force say obehwe ama flood na no asi tax force ndi alupre ko na nam wiem abusia so after that no yete say report bi ababonten a omo ama recommendation di ebetumi aye di asi flood na kwan afi ante ho atam bi ene say yinsu akoto a abefa nipa eno nti ama manfo bebre especially NPP for no de omo di blame no ekọ de ma ban no say ban no ana abon because the tax force no omo ye waste of money nti sebi se omo ye serious kura na wo say nka tax force no samere wogu no ana wangunu kura na nipa bia wo ye serious wo awiase se wo bobra chichiro man bia no tax force wa ya tie intimacy flood no kwan de enko betuma resign nanso den na eba mampanyini asane tax force fu yisa ko na mwimbra ni nsuo yiri ama asabe fa manfo na eno achi no ana NDC fo ni bi excuses ana ebidi ma enyina yehu bi amanfo de nam ne se Red Bank di sika ba na sika na eba ye no NPP fo di sika no ana manfa nko ye adwuma no eno nti omuni se so mbe kasa de fa flood na ekoso no because Montman siano kwan 8 years ye di sika ba Red Bank di 350 million dollars by Montman yusu dia monka manom fantum na sa asem wi ana Red Bank report about bontin no breakdown of sikano said yesi ayusu no ani de ekoso nyina no ebusia ye de honsem ebrewo enkomo wi akoso e wo join news a mepese nyina enkotie bi na apart from that no since say issue ni ba bontin ye say Red Bank abeka say sikano mpo na amoka ho asem no sikana da ho ye nyusu yi ana afi report ni gusu ba na eba na ba na eba no e say 2026 we no say sikana mu bi NDC for yusu say sikana mu bi na omodi sikana ye den sika ye si nyusu ye no e den ye yusu mu bi abusia mpese me kan se me bepere ni enkweti expose breakdown of sikana the Garrett project na emanfo bi ye excuses say it means and ba fan so be flood no de na disikana ye yenko sanse me nyina bi we are na fa adwonkyere to comment section ase.
A week on, many are still counting your losses, and government is still mobilizing support to try and bring relief to them. But in the wake of all that, hard questions are being asked about the solution. One of the central pillars of that is GARIC, the Greater Accra Resilient Integrated Program that, in fact, the World Bank made a loan available to us to help us address all matters dealing with the floods, $350 million worth from the World Bank financing that was meant to help us deal and to make us resilient in the face of the flooding that has been affecting homes for years. But the key questions are beginning to emerge about how this funds was spent and the fiscal measures that have been introduced by this current government to deal with the way it was spent in the past, presumably. And tonight we'll go to that. and then we'll get my guests to weigh in. So what really is Ghanaian? It was to do a few things: reduce flood risk in the Odo River basin, and that area we know has been a perennial problem, but also to strengthen waste collection and disposal. Why is that important? Because we know that it's a waste that blocks the drains and makes it impossible for the floodwaters to have free-flowing path into the sea. Then also to reduce indiscriminate dumping of and blocking of drains, which is an important part of dealing with this, and improve sanitation across the areas in question, implementing and across these 17 MDAs in the Greater Accra region. So it was very focused, and it had very prescribed terms and what the monies were supposed to be used for. Now, we'll come to why this is important. But then the World Bank did an assessment recently, which really opened up this conversation and rated it moderately unsatisfactory. Why? Because the World Bank said, in essence, that the fiscal controls that have been put in place were slowing down the disbursement. But if you look at it, there's a total of $350 million that was made available through this loan facility from the World Bank. So far, the disbursement up until April 2026 is 137 million. That's 40% of the amount. And we're talking about some undisbursed of 213 million. And we'll get the latest figures from the Finance Ministry when we sit down for a conversation. But this is according to the World Bank itself in its report that we've recently seen. And this is basically the conclusion why the delay, which fundamentally was down to the fiscal measures that have been introduced. Now, the key question that we will try to answer tonight is why these fiscal measures became important, because that has been where the disagreements have been. And so you will see on the back of this, you see, for example, the Nkrumah, who used to be the Works and Housing Minister, make a point about the fiscal measures, that people are dying. You do not want to prioritize fiscal discipline, if you like, over preventing the loss of life. So he's made a point. So it became politicized in the face of the World Bank's assessment of the execution of this particular project under the Garrick initiative with 350 billion. You have the minority leader also making a point of this. So what really was happening, according to the BOG, the bank of the World Bank, there was a ceiling that was placed on the project disbursement, and then there was a 13.8 million temporarily swept from the project account. We'll get some clarity on that when we sit down. The delayed contractors' payments, and then the slow execution of civil works. Now, the important thing to note from what we're now learning, we've seen what this did was to force a bit more transparency around the questions around the fiscal controls. So the details now beginning to emerge tell a slightly different story, which is why really was there these strict measures put in place now under this current government to deal with these challenges. Now, what we find in the documentation, which will be publishing, the research desk will publish, is, and these were the issues that apparently then convinces this current government to slow down, but also make sure you put in place stricter measures to check the misapplication of the funds, because I've told you what the funds were meant for. So you see here, for example, in some of the line items that were disbursed in 2020, 500,000 cedis for management of training at Aqua Safari. And the question was, okay, fundamentally the money was for flood prevention and resilience. So was this justified, for example, is the question that was asked. Then you have, again, another 500,000 thereabout on end of year retreat. What was that for? And was that to deliver on the core mandate of Garrick? That was in 2022. Then you have 2023, you have this 11,000 on meetings and fuel for trip for project directors. So you have November 2023, you have 100,000 fuel coupons for Ministry of Sanitation and Water Resources. You also have, almost a 50,000 for salt cutting ceremony, 16,000, 23,000. For some very interesting things that the questions are now being asked about. And I understand that the Parliament itself is going to be looking into this. The Deputy Minister was supposed to appear before the joint committees responded for this, so that we could get some further clarity. but the documentation around the expenditure is now beginning to emerge, giving us clarity over the disbursements over the period. That is the justification for the fiscal controls that have been put in place. And a lot of this raises fundamental questions about misapplication for issues for things like COVID and other expenditure that didn't go directly to alleviating or mitigating flooding, right? We'll ask those questions and get some answers when we sit down for a conversation. And if you go back to the World Bank report, it talks about the annual breakdown of the total direct payments that we've seen over time. And you look at 2019, for example, there was just a 540,000 that was disbursed from there, but it climbed steadily, reaching a peak of 160 million in 2025, right? And if you look at 2023, you have a 98 million. You look at 2024, you have 113 million. And I get a sense, and I remember this very clearly, the previous minister under the Akufo-Addo regime had told us then that he was also expecting some money to come in so they can do a few things in terms of dredging the Odo, and that had delayed at the time too. But if you look at over the period, significant amounts have been disbursed. Even in 2025, in spite of the World Bank's flagging of the delays, significant amount of 160 million has still gone out, according to the World Bank itself, and then 130 million now also in 2026. We'll get the latest figures, but this is according to the World Bank itself in its report, and that has been released. Then you look at the breakdown of the guide payments and the focus on the civil works alone, right? There's a lot there in the Excel sheet that details what money was spent on. The civil works over time has also climbed steadily, reaching 34 million cedis in 2024, but had gone up all the way to 103 million, according to the World Bank itself, in 2026. And then we are talking about some 98 million in 2025. So you look at the amounts of money that have gone into civil works. These are monies that the breakdown of the Gary payments that had already gone out. And then you look also at the breakdown of the finance ministry's Gary payments, which part of the nitty-gritties, the granular details I mentioned earlier, some of the questions that then prompted the tightening of the fiscal controls. But if you look at it more broadly, between 2019 and 2026, you have civil works of 250 million cedis gone out already, and you have goods and service, goods, equipment and vehicles, 132. And then the questions that we always ask in these matters is that we're spending a lot of money on vehicles, possibly, that doesn't go directly to dealing with the problem. But of course, equipment you need. What about the goods? Consultancy services. Red flags will always emerge when you're dealing with consultancy services. You need to pry that open and look at, are there questions there of propriety in the expenditure of 91 million cedis during that period, and then compensation, settlement, training, workshop, and meetings. And for me, that is a fascinating, jaw-dropping one. Training, workshops, and meetings. Between 2019 and 2026, we spent 34 million cedis on training, workshops, and meetings. You need to break this down and ask the hard questions whether we're spending that money right. And my guess weighing whether or not there's a justification for this tightening of the fiscal controls by this current administration on the back of these questions. That is obvious, you must ask on the face of it. If you're spending 34 million on training workshops, you must ask yourself whether you're spending it right and whether you shouldn't tighten it a bit more to ensure that the money goes directly to what it was originally intended for. And then you look also, again, still on the World Bank report telling us a bit, 2026 guide funding gap there of $23.3 million. And you must ask the question, why is there a gap? Because the money's already been released. Why are we not sending all 23.3 million out for it to be used to mitigate flooding, right? So then you have the approvals, the civil works contract that we know is awaiting approval of 78.8. So yes, you've disbursed quite a huge number, but there is still a lot more that needs to go, right? That needs to go. The question is, do you simply, because it's meant to go, 79.8 million, do you simply release the funds, or do you ensure that you're releasing the funds for the actual intended purpose? Is a question. You need to find a fair balance between that and speed, because you need to do it quickly to avert what has happened. And my guests will weigh in when we sit down for a conversation. So again, a government corrective measures that is in the report, by the way. So we've seen that 10.5 million withdrawal process has been processed now as of February 2026. So the correcting the delays after the measures have been put in place to ensure that the monies go, and we've seen that some of disbursements are already going according to the World Bank itself. So we'll sit down for a conversation.